We're at 7:34 and there's still some folks coming in, but I'll let them in as they come. And why don't we get started? So I want to welcome everybody tonight for another living classroom presentation of the Rivertowns Pollinator Pathway. I'm Chet Kerr, and I run the Irvington Pollinator Pathway. The Pollinator Pathways project mission is to engage and educate the community about pollinators and native plants and reducing pesticides, promoting public awareness about the crucial role the pollinators play, and raising awareness about and preserving and protecting open space and parks. Just a quick note, we are having a question and answer session at the end of tonight's presentation. Feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, which Melissa can try to address during the Q&A after she's done with her presentation. And I just want to let everybody know that we are recording tonight's session as well. So tonight we're very lucky to be hearing from Melissa Reavis, who lives in Hastings-on-Hudson with her family and also directs the residential studio at Hollander Design in New York City. Melissa is a registered landscape architect in New York and New Jersey, and as part of her job, she's actively involved designing gardens and outdoor spaces. Tonight, she will talk about how to design healthy gardens and landscapes that benefit insects, plants, animals, and humans, and support biodiversity and sustainability for our world. So with that, let me turn it over to Melissa. Please take it away.
Thank you, Chet. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Let me just get this program going here. All right. So just want to first start out by saying I am on day maybe 10 of the flu/upper respiratory issues. So I might have to stop and take a few breaks with water and tea, and I've got everything lined up here. So hopefully it doesn't delay me too much there. So I want to say that first, I've given this lecture now a couple of times, or some similar version of it. And when I was first putting it together, I was asking everyone in my office for a little help with the title. And it was one of my business partners who said, you should call it Talking About the Birds and the Bees. And initially I was mortified by this suggestion. First, public speaking isn't always the easiest thing. And then combine that with the idea of using a euphemism for reproduction in front of a crowd. I was definitely blushing through probably the first few times I gave this presentation. But I've kept it because annoyingly, he was spot on with that title, because mentioning the birds and the bees conversation gives many people, or maybe just me, a visceral reaction of a memory of an intensely uncomfortable conversation. And truthfully, that's not a terrible comparison, because when we start to talk about the intersection of nature and landscape, we touch on some difficult topics. Climate change and habitat destruction, extinction events, insects. And at a time when it's becoming increasingly more difficult to talk about tough subjects with even our closest family members, I think this is really good practice. So as we head into a season of holiday parties and family dinners, maybe I can give you some tools to help you have easy conversations about gardens and insects. And maybe give you some advice on how to make some changes in your own landscape. And just a note that a lot of the projects you're going to see here today are from Hollander Design's portfolio. So they may be of a different scale, but the lessons are still the same. And we've been able to encourage our clients to think more about the role that they play as stewards of land, because I think we bring a combination of science and research, beauty, and a lightness to these conversations that I hope you'll be able to pass some of this on to your friends and family. So before I dive in, I have to give the 5-minute little spiel of who Hollander Design is, because while some of you may know our firm, because I have spoken here with Chet before, you probably don't know much about our design process or how we approach a project. And I think that's really important background to talk about, how we developed our guiding principles before I tell you how we relay these messages to our clients and incorporate them into our own work. So we've been in business for over 30 years, and it's grown from this group of 4 to around 35 landscape architects, environmental planners, horticulturalists who work across 3 offices in New York City, Sag Harbor, and Chicago. And we design landscapes at every scale and all over the world. We've been recognized by some of these great organizations listed here. And I've been with Hollander Design for 16 years, which is more than half of its existence now. And I can tell you that our approach to design has changed a lot from when I first started. But at the core, we've always started by listening, and we're listening to learn more about 3 specific things, which we call our ecologies. So the first is architectural ecology, which focuses on the structural components of a site, how we respond to that architecture and reflect design ideas in our landscape. For example, this building is actually in Hastings, and the building design arose from the architect, Stephen Hull, studying ice flows down the river. And we took some of those study diagrams that he created and started to abstract them for our own paving patterns and pathways and markers through the site. And you can see that in some of the images here. The second thing that we look at is human ecology, which would be our client or clients in this case. This is 111 Murray, a condominium tower in Tribeca. And it's important for us to think about how humans interact in our landscape, what their needs and desires will be, what their aesthetic preferences are, what their circulation patterns will be for pedestrians and vehicles, and so on and so on. And you can see how those circulation patterns here really kind of drove the design. The last thing that we're looking at is site ecology, which is everything from the climate or microclimates to topography and the flow of water, the native fauna and flora of a site, right down to the composition of the soils. And the biggest change over the last 10 years has been with those last 2 ecologies, the human ecology and the site ecology, and how they interact and function side by side. And we've spent a lot of time studying and analyzing these interactions to come up with some better strategies within our own office, because this is where the friction is. People can have a really hard time living with nature, and that's led to some really destructive practices within our own industry. And we're really seeing the consequences of that now. So before we get into that lightness that I mentioned earlier, we're going to get a bit heavy first, because it's important that we understand the problem we're currently facing that's necessitating this conversation about birds and bees. So hopefully some of these headlines look familiar to you, as the idea of this 6th extinction event is not new. This has been talked about for many years now. But this headline is just from earlier this year. So this is a peer-reviewed scientific paper, essentially saying that if you consider invertebrates or insects in our extinction calculations, there's really no question that we're currently in a mass extinction event. So just to understand how big of a deal that is, the definition of mass extinction is that 3/4 of all species vanish forever. And that is where scientists agree that we're heading. So this graph shows the current extinction rates of mammals, of birds, of vertebrates, other vertebrates, and it's comparing it to the background extinction rate, which is this dotted line here. And that's simply the rate of loss of species if we didn't take human interference into account. So this is how many species we would lose to things like natural selection, reproductive fitness, new predators. But the point is, it's gradual. And we've known for a while now that we're losing species at a fairly alarming rate. But once we added insects into the calculation, which was an entire group that we were not previously cataloging, obviously, it went from being somewhat alarming to an absolute crisis. We're losing biodiversity much faster than we had realized. So scientists generally agree that we're in this 6th extinction event, which obviously means in all of history, it's only happened 5 other times. So just to give you a little background, this is the Permian mass extinction, and this was the worst extinction event. About 96% of all life forms went extinct. And of course, nobody knows exactly what caused it, but most people who study this agree that it was likely an eruption of a supervolcano, which led to temperature increases in greenhouse gases. This is the KT mass extinction. This is the famous one that killed all the dinosaurs, and is the only one that's actually linked to an extraterrestrial object. So it took out about 80% of all species when an asteroid collided with the Earth at the Yucatan Peninsula. And this, at the end here, is our current extinction event. And it's unique for a few reasons, mainly how fast it's happening. That's almost a straight line that's dotted there. And because it's being caused by us, a single species. So it's all pretty grim, and I'm going to get to some really pretty garden pictures very soon, because truly, I'm just here to talk about the role that residential landscapes can play in at least the slowing of this extinction event. So you may be wondering why we're looking at residential or private property to solve such a big problem. And this man is a huge reason why. So this is E.O. Wilson, and hopefully some of you have heard of him. He was a renowned biologist and Harvard professor for, I think, over 46 years, who passed away just last year. And he had a radical idea that we should preserve half the surface of the earth, so both land and oceans, for biodiversity. And by his calculations, some 84% of species could be saved, potentially reversing that extinction event if we protected that land. So just 50% of Earth. The problem is we're not protecting nearly enough right now. So currently only 15% of land and 4% of oceans are protected. And already people have used up nearly 50% of habitable land just for farms and livestock. So if we're doing the math, that means that almost anything that's not a farm should be looked at for protection or a preserve of some kind. And of course, putting that much land into protected preserves that are untouched by humans is not possible. We already know that a huge amount of the United States looks like this. But again, E.O. Wilson said that's not necessary. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said, we can take fragments, both small and large, from private property around the world and get closer to 50%. So gardens like this, with a reimagined maintenance, could be a part of that. And a lot of smart people are pushing for that now. So a lot of you probably know who this is. This is Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist from the University of Delaware, who started a movement called Homegrown National Park. And they're asking homeowners to just plant native plants as a way to create these protected spaces for biodiversity. Their initial goal is 20 million acres of native plants in the US. And that sounds like a lot, but that's only half of the current lawn area on private property. So we currently have 40 million acres of lawn in the United States. So the goal is simple. Take unused areas of lawn and create gardens, create meadows, create planted spaces. And together, those newly planted areas would create ecological networks that enlarge populations of plants and animals, enabling them to weather normal fluctuations. So that creation of safe habitat is crucial for biodiversity, and it's crucial to avoid extinction. And this garden would count. So here we've limited the area of lawn for this family to a small space just off the back of the house. And we've reclaimed large portions all around the edge, and we're maintaining it with biodiversity in mind. So this gets to be a reserve. Just by planting it and leaving it and reimagining our maintenance, we get to think of this differently on this property. Unfortunately, this message is not spreading. This is still the state of most residential landscapes in the US. And I truly believe that most homeowners they don't know how destructive this environment is. They're not reading scientific papers written by entomologists. They're just doing their civic duty, right? They're just maintaining their yard. And this is what we've always known, and this is what we've always been told to do. So How did we get here? This is an incredibly important part of the story that often gets left out of this conversation. We need to understand why we're drawn to places like this and spaces like this, because it helps us have these important messages with our clients or with your friends and with your neighbors. And we can go all the way back to the founding of the United States to see just how ingrained this idea of lawns and civic duty is. So this lawn as a green carpet is a concept that Americans borrowed from European gardens and estates. We brought this image to the United States because it became a symbol that our newly formed United States could match or even top Europe. And at the time, lawns in Europe were an early status symbol. They were signs that their owners could afford to dedicate grounds to just aesthetic concerns rather than agricultural purposes. The lawn was a true sign of wealth and privilege. Whoops. And Thomas Jefferson surrounded Monticello not just with neatly rowed crops, but with expanses of sheared grass that served no other purpose but to send a message that the ambitions of our newly formed nation were the same as Europe or better. And that tie to patriotism is still very much a part of our current culture. You can see not much has changed at Monticello over the past 200 years, and that deep tie will be hard to overcome. But this might be even harder to overcome. So what's so incredible about this painting, I'm sure some of you recognize it, it's The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, is that it's from the early 1500s. So before the widespread custom of formal gardens and large estates, when most people still had to use their limited space to grow food and medicinal herbs, this was representing paradise, and paradise to them had a lawn. So what this might actually show is that our landscape preferences go beyond just trends and patriotism. The allure of lawns might actually be in our genes. And a lot of sociobiologists think so, and they've gone so far to propose a savanna syndrome to explain our fondness for grass. So encoded in our DNA is a preference for an open, grassy landscape resembling the short grass savannas of Africa on which we evolved and spent our first few million years, because there's comfort in this landscape. We could easily see predators, which may explain why we have remade the largely wooded landscapes of Europe and North America in the image of East Africa. We're having a really hard time escaping our preferences. And our clients today, and many of our friends, still have these ingrained preferences. Okay, that's the end of my lawn rant, and we're very close to garden pictures. But as a designer, it's important to appreciate why people are drawn to certain things, in my case, lawns, because in order to come up with creative solutions, we have to fully understand the problem and people's preferences. And it's a big problem. So just to recap, we're trying to slow the potential extinction of our own species. We have to overcome our own genetics and rethink our ideas of patriotism in order to save insects. It's not an easy task. But this picture here could show a potential solution. Not every lawn needs to be turned into tall grass meadows. This is a simple fescue treatment that still provides habitat and makes people feel much more comfortable with transitioning away from lawn. This can just be the first step to getting to that healthier landscape and can provide a backdrop to the future pollinator gardens that we're hoping to establish here. And the good news is that even with our innate love for these landscapes, change is happening. Gardeners around the world who are in touch with the land are pushing for a different aesthetic. And we can look to those English estates again and see that designers are pushing for softer, wilder aesthetics. Meadows and prairies are replacing lawns on these beautiful properties, and they're using our North American natives to do that. But as landscape architects and as gardeners and as stewards of land, all of us at our company feel that need and that urgency to take responsibility for the care of our spaces, because no one is better positioned to take on this responsibility of reversing this extinction event than us, and probably all of you, because I imagine we have a lot of gardeners here, because we can understand the problem. Now, entomologists have told us that currently 40% of insects globally are at risk of extinction. And that's bad news because their removal from an ecosystem has downstream effects. So for example, a single nest of chickadees eats 9,000 caterpillars from when they hatch to when they fledge. So what will they eat if the insects all disappear? Like, what will frogs and fish and bats eat? What will ladybugs and dragonflies eat? What will pollinate our crops? The loss of insects leads to the loss of all other species. So if entomologists have laid out the problem, botanists and horticulturists have done the research to say our solution is a combination of native plants and increased habitats. We have to give the insects a safe space to live and food to eat. And we know that insects and plants have co-evolved and that they need each other to survive because nothing exists in isolation. So that's a lot of information, and it probably seems a bit overwhelming, but there are actually some really simple places to begin. And these are the areas that we've started to focus on in our own design work. So I'm going to walk you through some of the information now and show you some projects that we're really proud of in our office to show you how residential firms can affect real change and hopefully some ways that you can incorporate this into your own gardens and homes. So the first thing that we really did as an office was dive into studying plant communities. And just to be clear, what I'm presenting in our work is designed plant communities. They're more of a translation of a wild environment, and they're not always ecological restorations. We're not 100% native in our work unless we're working in restricted areas, because we're designing spaces for both humans and nature. So it's more of a hybrid of horticulture and ecology. And this project is a great example of that. This is in Sagaponack out on Long Island, and it fronts on Sag Pond. And the first thing that we did here was the wetland restoration that you can see in the back. And that plant palette really set the tone for the rest of this project. So in order to connect the architecture back to the landscape, we took that plant community and we used that as an inspiration of our gardens. You can kind of see in this bird's eye view how a lot of the colors are moving through the landscape through here. And it actually goes into some meadows that we have up here as well. And that doesn't mean that we don't have a healthy amount of hydrangeas here, because I don't think it's necessary to deprive ourselves of some strictly ornamental plants in the name of biodiversity. I'm actually going to touch on this a little bit more at the end of the lecture, but especially in the areas where people are sitting for extended periods of time like this. This is probably not the area where you want to have plants that are attracting lots of bees. But the important point here is to start with the restoration work. That's what we're doing in our own work. Often that takes the longest to fill in, which is true of meadows too. And if you start the project that way, you're changing the conversation. If you start with the natural spaces first, you're ensuring that those spaces look good, if not better, than the more manicured landscapes in your structures. Then this image shows really well how we started to move further into the landscape and away from those seating areas. We start to vary our palette to include more of the pollinator-friendly plants. And this can be the same on your own properties. So if you live next to natural spaces, if you live near water or meadow or a woodland, using those spaces as your palette for your own property will really help to bring some of that native plant material in and also extend your views back out, right? One of the great things about this project and the restoration along the pond is that natural material allowed us to connect across the pond into other wetland areas, and their views are extended because of that. It makes the property look a lot larger. And as a part of this project, we actually had a chance to do a rooftop terrace, which is odd for us out in more residential spaces. And instead of the normal pots or those low seated mats, we try to take the idea of those plant communities and create more of a meadow experience on a rooftop. And this ties a roof back to the landscape. And you might be thinking, oh, didn't she just say don't plant pollinator plants directly next to your seating spaces? I did, but it's really important to keep in mind the time of day that you're using your spaces. So this is off of the primary bedroom and it's actually used mostly at night. And because of that, most of the things that are up here are being pollinated by bees and butterflies, which are daytime pollinators, which means they're not bothering them when they're out here. And that really allowed us to expand our palette up here. You know, we took those plants from the meadows and boardwalks from our pond restoration and created another space for people and pollinators. And what's so interesting about this roof deck is that through our maintenance, we're seeing that we might be attracting more pollinators to this space. And I can't really explain why that might be, other than there's certainly fewer people who use this space, but there's also no lawn being mowed on a weekly basis, for example. There's no leaf blowers being used up here. This is all hand maintenance, right? So there's no machinery making loud noise at all. So I think spaces like this can be a real haven for pollinators. So we started out with studying plant communities, and there are additional lessons that we can take from that research that we start to apply to our own work. And one of those is that nature exists in zones and layers. And that's something that you'll easily pick up from studying forested communities. So woodlands have different zones, interiors, edges, canopy gaps are the most common. This image clearly shows an edge condition. That zone is usually a symptom of human activity. So a driveway cutting through the woodland creates edges. A highway cutting through an area also creates edges. And nature's response to that is creating a seal. So when you drive down a highway, you'll see clearly that vines are starting to climb up the peripheral trees, and vines are a really common sealant in nature. It's a curtain of foliage on the edge that's actually protecting interior spaces. We prefer to seal our spaces with a nice combination of perennials and shrubs, but learning about those zones and how nature responds helps us create healthy ecosystems. So that edge planting reduces excess light and desiccating winds into the woodland areas, protecting the more sensitive plants within. That also allows us to create these little fun moments by piercing that edge condition and controlling views into the space. So we can use it from a design perspective too. And this project is a great example of zones and layers. Our office has been working on the site for almost 20 years, and it's been a real pleasure to watch it grow and evolve over time. So as you can see, this is not a small project, hence the 20 years. It originally started with just 2 lots here at the main house. And it's developed and it's grown, and it's, as the homeowner purchased more and more property with the hopes that his children and grandchildren will build homes here with him. I'm going to show you how those zones and this property, starting at the top here, quickly making our way back down to the Double Dunes, which is an area that East Hampton is really famous for. So as you enter the property, you come through a series of meadows and a collection of trees that is somewhat a newly established meadow. And if you have time on your side, which we obviously do here, it's a much easier establishment process to start with grasses and then slowly create drifts of flowers. What this allows us to do is really make an easy maintenance regime for the landscape company here. So you don't have to know a lot. You just have to know that you have to take out anything in the meadow that's got a broadleaf. So it allows us to get a healthy ecosystem up and going before we insert the flowers. And this entry sequence is a great example of how a design space can still have ecological potential. You know, we've simplified the palette. And we'll start to exaggerate natural patterns with flowers to make them more legible and ordered for those who are viewing them, but no less important to the insects in these spaces. And, you know, these trees are truly magnificent and maybe don't necessarily have a lot to do with today's topic, but I love how sculptural they feel in the landscape. And over time, they've taken on these new forms as the wind is blown through them and sculpted them, and the weather is really transformed them. It feels like you're driving through a really magical arboretum. And as we arrive at the main house, we start to have more form to the gardens. Especially in the entry sequence here, these start to become extensions of the architecture. And this walkway connects the main house to the guest house, and we run these long borders of lavender under the topiary hydrangeas. And these are absolutely alive with bees when they're flowering. We've set them off the path just far enough to allow you to experience that sound of the bees and the smell of the lavender without feeling like you're immediately on top of them. And directly off the back of the house, we have a series of formal gardens leading to the pool beyond. There's an herb garden directly off the back of the house. There's an oval rose garden. They're all organized on this spine of brick arbors. And this is a fairly early image, actually, of this project. Because to either side of this space, what used to be lawn has now been completely reimagined. We've started to relax our palette and soften the geometries to connect this landscape back to the natural spaces. This shows you that rose walk that connects you from the house to the pool house and how it's kind of matured over time. And the oval garden, which is an amazingly sweet space for their grandchildren. So again, these are the original gardens from 15 years ago. And now you can see how our palette has evolved. So this is to the left of that pool area in that previous image, and you can see how we've started to make our connections in a much softer way back to the meadows beyond. And this is a great image to show how both those layers and those zones. So there's an edge condition here along the path that we've sealed up with perennials. And there's an edge condition along the back of the property that we've sealed with a hedgerow. And there are zones of perennial plantings and zones of shorter grasses. There are groves of trees, and each one of these areas are serving different pollinator populations. And as we get closer to the dunes, we've moved back to that really simple palette that we started with. And it's giving you kind of that image back to the front of the property of driving through that arboretum. And these are a few of the native cherries that we preserved through construction. And they've also been sculpted by the winds, just like the trees at the front. And in our own work, we do a lot of restoration of sensitive areas like wetlands and coastal dunes. And it's important to understand how those zones change as you move throughout them. You know, the seaward and the landward side of dune crests are completely different environments. And these areas are so important for changing a client's preconception about what their land and their ownership means. I mean, this is a communal space. I mean, it's private property, but as you can see here, this is a visitor that many of us get. But it's still incredibly important that clients and homeowners have the ability to walk through these spaces because you have to interact with them. You have to be face to face with nature to begin to understand it and to develop a love for it. And love underpins care. When you love something or someone, you do everything in your power to care for them or it. You protect what you love. I don't know if that's the same for this guy here, but he's still part of our environment. But when you're in these spaces, you're more in tune with the world around you. And that's part of the magic of the landscape. When you stop and you pay attention, you see the life living in these spaces. And that life is made up of our native insect populations. And it's important that we learn about them and their needs. So, and the really important note here is that people and my clients have to become comfortable with insects in their gardens and understand the role that they play. And this project is a great example of that. So this is a site we just completed last year. So it's brand new, but the incorporation of host plants is still really well on display. So this property sits at the end of a peninsula surrounded by Mecox Bay and has many important ecological areas. We have a buffer at the bulkhead here, and then a wetlands pocket at the western side of the property. And these are all great spaces to incorporate host plants. Because a few years ago now, we actually made a pledge to ourselves and within the office that we'd plant milkweed on every job we've done. And we've actually gone back and planted into spaces that we've already completed. And I want to show you this image because this is the only area of contiguous lawn on the entire property. And it feels like enough. You know, it beautifully illustrates the subtle curve of the landscape elements as it responds to the architecture and the bay beyond. But we started with the client's needs for their children. And we took that very small envelope and we built the gardens around that. And there's a lot of really well-known landscape architects and garden designers that say, think of your lawn as that area rug. And if you size that rug first and bring your gardens to it, it'll feel much more appropriate for the size of the property. And that small area of lawn means we get to create connections like this. You know, this pool feels like it's floating over the bay, and you can just barely see the natural buffer in the distance where we have those drifts of milkweed for the monarchs. And that's an important space because I'm sure many of you know, given that you're at a garden lecture, that recently the International Union for the Conservation of Nature classified monarchs as endangered species, which is probably a great decision because that means that funding will now be available to help this cause. But it's also given us another avenue to have these conversations with our clients about host plants. So some of you may know this as well, but host plants or keystone plants are unique to local food webs within ecoregions. It's what the larval form of many insects feed on. So milkweed, shown here, is the host plant for the monarch, meaning it's the food that the caterpillar eats. Another important note is that the host plants are meant to be eaten. So it's a good thing when you see your plants being nibbled. That means it's not only providing a benefit for you and its beauty, but you're also supporting the local ecosystem at the same time. And any of you that have milkweed in your yard knows that they can be eaten to the ground and it'll resprout those leaves and it'll look beautiful for you very quickly after that process. It also means that we're supporting the entire life cycle of an insect. If you want butterflies, you need to grow caterpillars. So it's important to learn about the life cycle of an insect so we can better understand how to create landscapes that support them in all stages. So I'm going to quickly touch on this. This is the life cycle of a butterfly, just to show you how important it is to understand that process. I mean, I could do an entire lecture on this, but I will keep it brief. So a butterfly lays her egg on a leaf. The caterpillar then hatches from that egg, eats as much of that leaf as it can, and then it's ready to form a chrysalis or a cocoon if it's a moth. So very often that caterpillar leaves its host plant, travels to find a new plant to pupate on, because that's a form of protection, right? If every caterpillar stayed in the same place, then it becomes really easy for predators to find it. And many caterpillars actually bury themselves into leaf litter, into the soil to pupate. But monarchs specifically build a chrysalis, and it's typically on a shrub or a tree or on a structure. So with that in mind, you can see how important trees are in these natural spaces. If they have to travel too far to find a suitable space, they'll die in that journey. So in our planting plans, we try to provide food for the caterpillars in the form of host plants, structure in the form of trees or shrubs, and nectars in our flowering spaces. And we work to explain that to our clients through diagrams that show their roles, the plants that are playing in a larger ecosystem. So this is a diagram that we created in our office for a current project. And we give this to the client as a part of our planting presentation. And it really helps to cut down on the amount of calls we receive on maintenance concerns, saying, something's eating all of my plants. If they make that phone call to the wrong person, that could mean a pesticide application is coming, which is just such a terrible feeling to go through all of this work to support insects and then see all those little yellow flags. So this part, the messaging is super important. Okay, Whimsy Farm. This is a huge favorite within our office. So once we've created these spaces for insects and other native fauna, it's incredibly important that we maintain it properly, which we've briefly touched on with the no pesticides. And this might seem like an obvious statement, but you can't use pesticides when you're trying to encourage biodiversity. And I'm shocked to have few of my clients really understand that or think that spraying for mosquitoes or ticks or somehow spares other insects, which is not true. And this is a wonderful project in East Hampton where we've experimented with different meadow options and lawn alternatives to great effect. We've also reduced maintenance in a lot of the borders and allowed plants to seed themselves throughout the garden. And it's created a really magical space. And gardens are magic. When you walk down a winding path and suddenly find a vista or a piece of sculpture or an unexpected new garden room, that sense of discovery, that's a powerful experience. But once you've walked that path and walked the garden 100 times, it loses maybe a little bit of that discovery. But what you realize is that the magic is really in the plants. Because when you look around the border and think, wait, that wasn't there last year, that's true magic. Something has appeared from nothing. The garden is evolving in front of your eyes. And here in the distance, you can kind of see our clover meadows. This borders the length of the entire entry drive, and it creates a habitat for insects. It's a great alternative for those who are not interested in those long grass meadows. It tends to make people feel very comfortable because it doesn't block sight lines. It's also a wonderful place for the bees, but it's not covered in bees, so it still feels comfortable space to walk through. It's also wonderful for soil health because it fixes nitrogen, which in turn helps other plants. And this shows a much more relaxed approach to formal parterres. This used to be a highly gardened space. Now the focus on the transition of those grasses from that soft summer form to those beautiful winter seed heads. We leave these grasses up all winter, and it provides shelter for pollinator and food for birds. And it collects the leaves, and it's a really beautiful space, and it feels comfortable because it doesn't feel like it's going to take the homeowners weeks and weeks to maintain these spaces. There's a sense of relaxation in a space that doesn't feel highly maintained. And who wouldn't want to sit here and witness that transformation? This is a perfect space to sit on a cold evening. And here too. So we have a lot of water features on this property, and water brings so much to a garden. It brings sound and movement, reflections and wildlife, and they all add different dimensions. Many birds and insects are actually attracted to the sound of water. So having like a bubbler or spout with running water not only helps to keep the water fresh, but it'll actually attract beneficial pollinators, such as bees. So migrating birds will actually drop out of the sky if they hear the sound of water. So if you're a birder, you absolutely should put something like this in your garden. And this again shows that even though we've softened the rest of the landscape, there are certain spots that just make sense to keep simple. So we don't have to invite the bees for dinner here, but they're certainly on the property. This is their productive garden. And this is probably our clients' first introduction to gardening and pollinators for most cases. This is the gateway garden. So most people will have, at least my clients, will have never dug in their own soil, until they ask us if they can grow a couple of tomatoes. It's the gateway vegetable. And then people fall in love with it. I read a quote the other day that said that gardening is the most obvious thing in the world, which is true. If you look at cultures all over the planet, people have always gardened primarily for food, but that human urge to garden is strong, and you see it everywhere. You see it with people who don't even have outdoor space growing houseplants. Gardening is a fundamental part of being human. And the minute you reconnect somebody with that urge, you can change their perspective. I mean, we've joked in our office that we're going to put it in our contract that every single client has to agree to a vegetable bed, because once they've been in charge of a plant, it really changes the way that they view their landscape. I also want to note here too that often when we talk about pollinator-friendly landscapes, we only think of naturalistic spaces like meadows or forests, but these productive gardens are also providing food for pollinators. And this is also a pollinator-rich habitat. So this image is of Great Dixter in the UK. We've obviously moved away from Hollander for a moment, but I think this is a really important thing to touch on, because over a period of 2 years, starting in 2017, they undertook a huge biodiversity study. Specialists were brought in from many different areas to look at mosses and lichens and liverworts, hoverflies and bees and spiders, all of the creatures over the entire 30 acres of its estate. And they divided it into different zones, such as the woodlands, the pasture, the meadows, formal ornamental gardens, ponds. Each zone was surveyed, and the findings were fed to one principal ecologist who analyzed and pulled the information together into a report. And the results were astonishing. So as expected, the wider estate with its woodlands and pastures and meadows were extremely rich. But surprisingly, the richest part of all was the ornamental garden. Although all those zones work together with one feeding another, the survey clearly showed that the garden, even with its exotic species and seasonal changes, supported an extraordinary amount of wildlife. They hadn't specifically gardened in these areas for biodiversity like they had in other areas. It was just there as a byproduct. And that obviously is a bit counterintuitive. So why would that be, that the more intensely gardened spaces would have the highest biodiversity? But those gardens provided a lot of the things that we touched on earlier, botanically and structurally rich habitat, with the borders mimicking a natural plant succession, with one layer taking over from another, providing a prolonged period of pollen and nectar almost year-round. And that's especially crucial at times when wildflowers have more or less finished. And Great Dixter is famously a very actively maintained garden. For example, if they have tulips or bedding plants going in and being dug out a few months later. However, the biodiversity surveyors felt that that dynamic element was actually really important, because every time the gardeners went into the beds, they caused a disturbance. And it's well established in plant ecology that an occasional disturbance is good for diversity. It creates opportunities for regeneration. So what was qualitatively different about the Great Dixter survey was that it showed exactly how many conventional garden practices, such as annual displays or exotic species or disturbance, are not necessarily, in a suitable context, detrimental, and that they may even add to diversity. And it's important to note that the gardeners here do not use any herbicides, they do not use any pesticides, and that's led to a balance between host and predator species that keeps the gardens looking healthy without the need for chemical interventions. And I think it's a really important garden to look at, because I think too often, when we get into these discussions about native or natural landscapes, that it feels very much like we have to give up some things that we deeply care for as gardeners. And that's just not the case. There's always going to be room for your tulips, as long as you make room for biodiversity as well. But now, one of the most loved British gardens can look forward to a new reincarnation as a biodiversity preserve, and a place to appreciate how a dense network of living things can flourish in what was almost an entirely artificial environment. It's a prime example of how biodiversity conservation can be integrated into gardening, demonstrating how gardens can play a crucial role in reversing that loss of biodiversity. We now know that gardens are not the sterile places that many ecologists had assumed, and much in the same way that wildlife gardens don't have to be those weedy bramble patches. The assumption of a lot of people is that natural spaces need to look natural, and that's not always the case, not in our own personal gardens at least. And if the fact that those gardens at Great Dixter are teeming with insects doesn't keep people away, then I know that we, and my clients specifically, can learn to live with them too. And it shows that we can take these lessons and apply them anywhere. We have no excuse to not create landscapes that foster biodiversity. Classical formality may appear unnatural, but that's not necessarily anti-nature. Do birds and butterflies really care whether food and nesting sites are in organic curves or straight lines? And it's important because we need to do it now. So this is an image from a New York Times article that was published earlier this year. The areas in red show the places in the US that are most likely to have plants and animals at high risk of global extinction. Hundreds of species that have no protection under current federal and state law. The areas in green show where land is permanently protected for biodiversity. So you can see that the habitats of the most imperiled species are outside of conservation zones. Currently, about 13% of the US is permanently protected and managed primarily for biodiversity. The Biden administration has set a goal to conserve and restore 30% of land and water by 2030, which is a push known by 30 by 30. But as you can see here, most of the regions that are being set aside for conservation will not be in these red zones, because this map might as well be a population map. This is where the residential properties are. This is where we need environmental leaders. Because even if we can get our government to put aside 30% of land and our public spaces are trending towards green infrastructure, we're never going to get to that 50% without a push for residential change. And the front lines of the battle for nature are not in the Amazon rainforest or the Alaskan wilderness. The front lines are in all of our backyards. And our office now plants with all creatures in mind, from the smallest invertebrates up to the humans that will be the future stewards of this land. And we talk about habitat creation and try to balance our spaces between areas that are kept a bit wilder, ornamental gardens with some level of intervention, and then some spaces for lawn, as we know it serves a purpose for some families. But this shows this is actually a parking area for the cars. So it shows how we can even create spaces for vehicles, but do them in a green and environmentally sensitive way. And we do our best to soften hardscape wherever possible, because that's another chance for habitat, for food, and for potentially shelter for pollinators. It reduces runoff and keeps surfaces cooler. We also pass on this information we've learned regarding species extinction and climate fluctuations to clients, because at some point we walk away from these projects, and we need homeowners to be informed, because they're taking on the responsibility of care for their landscape, for the diversity of life that lives there. And hopefully they'll pass on that message, because what happens on neighboring properties impacts the species on their land too. And that idea of stewardship and care over land can be an important portal for happiness. And great happiness doesn't have to come from wealth or relaxation. It comes from an engaged life. And a garden can do that for you. And now I'm extending that responsibility to all of you. And every one of you here are the caretakers of ecosystems. And we can start to undo many of the mistakes we've made. Our properties are more than assets to humans. We're part of an ecosystem that life itself depends on. So please, if you can't do the gardening yourself, support firms that are doing really great work, both designers and landscape maintenance firms, and help spread this message and save biodiversity where it's desperately needed in our backyards. And I really want to thank you again for coming, especially during the holiday season. And thank you, Chet, for giving us a platform to spread this message. And hopefully I have left some time tonight for some questions.
Thank you very much, Melissa. That was really good and very informative. I have a question for you in terms of the, obviously some of the scenes you showed are probably fairly larger, more elaborate properties, but what in terms of kind of plant lists do you provide people, or what kind of tools do you give people who are, they design your property, as you say, you leave them with what to do going forward?
Yeah, the planting presentation is really important because we do give them with a list of everything that's on their property. And then as a part of that, we give them a list of everything that is a host plant, so everything that's going to be nibbled on by pollinators, and then the role that each one of those plants play. And what that lets them know is that if in the future one of those trees has to come down, or it was diseased, or it came down in a storm, that it played a really vital role in that ecosystem, and it allows them to make that decision to replace it, right? So giving them more information about the role that everything in that environment is playing is a really important thing. And that's true of any scale, again, a lot of these are larger projects. That's only because it allows me to talk about more of what we've learned in these little individual spaces, but those are things that can be applied to think of properties of any scale.
Okay. I don't know if anybody, I don't think I've seen any other questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to put in the chat to Melissa? If so, please do so. I don't see any, Melissa. Well, let's see.
Right.
Yes. So here's a question. What do you do in your own landscape? You obviously live in Hastings, so what do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we moved into our house fairly recently, actually, so it's still very much a work in progress. But I have turned over the majority of our yard to vegetable gardening, and we have a large area of native grasses and plants. But because I use my property as a testing zone, it's a little haphazard, but there's always going to be an incorporation of things that are not necessarily native, or they're native adjacent. So I do plant a lot of things that are in zones that are like slightly warmer than what we're in, just as a test plot, because obviously our environment is constantly changing, weather patterns are changing. And so my property specifically is a little bit of a hodgepodge, but it was really important to me to turn over a large portion of it to vegetables because I have a young son. And so having him dig into the soil and learn more about where his food's coming from was just really important to me.
So another question, can you offer suggestions for plants in a small garden space?
So that's incredibly difficult to do because each space is going to have very different concerns or needs. So if you have a sunny spot or a shady spot, or if you're open to deer pressure, or even bunnies, or I have a groundhog. So it's all going to be very different. I will say that on our Hastings Pollinator Pathway website, we have a lot of really great resources, and it's broken down into whether or not you have a sunny spot or a shady spot, and they're really good for small spaces. So I would encourage you to start there.
Melissa, can you maybe what's the URL for the Hastings Pollinator? Do you know off the top of your head?
I do not know it off the top of my head, actually.
I can look for it. Why don't you keep talking? I'll look for it.
I'm sure I could put it into the chat in a second here.
I'll find it. I will find it.
But there is a lot of really wonderful information on there. And there's a lot of information about maintenance, and if anybody's looking to turn their lawns over to clover or to even meadows, there's really great resources on that website.
So another question, somebody just put in the chat. Another question is, what is your groundhog strategy?
Oh my, I wish I had one. So this groundhog is very persistent. We actually had gotten one of those safe traps, and taken it away a year ago. And somebody said, oh, don't do that because it's detrimental to remove them from their environment. And it can actually, you're essentially sending them to their demise. But that one came back. So he's very good. And I really don't have a great strategy for how to deal with him other than I have started to net all of my vegetables. And so over time, that has led him to go seeking food farther away. Hopefully next year he decides to move out, but I'm really waiting him out at this point. It's a terrible strategy.
Another question is, what native trees have you had luck with as food sources, such as nuts or birds and other animals?
Yeah, well, any oak is going to be your best bet in our area. And that's true actually anywhere in the United States. So our native oak species can support over 500 different varieties of moths and butterflies in just their larval form. So if you're going to plant a tree, the absolute best tree you can plant is an oak tree. In our Five Corners Garden in Hastings, which is something else that we outline on the pollinator pathway website, we've put in some willow oaks, which is a really great tree. And it's primed to be one of our best trees with climate change because it's a slightly warmer zone. It also has a very small, narrow leaf. So a lot of oaks get a bad rap because they drop very large leaves and they can be a difficult tree to clean up off of paved surfaces. Willow oaks are much lighter. So if I had one tree to plant, that's what I would always choose, but any oak is going to be a good bet.
Okay, one additional question, I think it's probably our last, but have you had any luck transplanting volunteer oak trees that appear in the wrong place? Are they hard to transplant?
So certain ones are. A lot of our native oak species are taprooted. And so the larger they get, the more difficult they are to transplant. But smaller species, so if you're finding something that's a volunteer and much smaller, it should do really well because at that point, their root system is small enough where they should take to transplanting really, really nicely. One of the reasons we used willow oak again is because it's not as known for its taproot. But no, they should do really well with transplanting. I would absolutely recommend trying that.
Okay, well, Melissa, thank you very much. It's now 8:36, and I think we've got a call it evening. But and anybody who have further questions, please feel free to reach out to Melissa directly. She has her email there on the screen, or you can reach out to me and I can pass along her contact information. But listen, I just want to thank you again for an interesting talk, a very thoughtful talk, and appreciate everybody for coming tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.